Friends, welcome to Decoder Talks, and today we will dot every I and cross every T. That so-called Coup narrative, sold to the public by Alexandre de Moraes as if it were revealed truth, collapses when confronted with the meticulous vote cast by Justice Luiz Fux. I will analyze the vote clearly and concisely without losing the thread, so that even you, who are not a lawyer or familiar with legal jargon, will easily understand why there was no attempted coup. Although several days have passed since the votes and the conviction of Bolsonaro, this record must be made and must become known to everyone interested in the truth, so that it becomes easy to explain even to the most unsuspecting how the process was vilified and distorted, turning the trial into nothing more than a political circus devoid of technical rigor, and how the verbosity of Alexandre de Moraes and his accomplices amounted to nothing more than allegories and fallacies easily dismantled under the light of law. This is not about political opinion or partisan cheering from the stands. This is about law, the one written in the Constitution and the Penal Code, not in headlines or fiery speeches. What Justice Fux of the Federal Supreme Court does, with the calm of someone who understands the weight of every word, is demolish, piece by piece, the accusation built by the reporting justice, Alexandre de Moraes, the international criminal. It is almost didactic. Without needing adjectives, he shows how the accusation stumbles over basic concepts, disrespects fundamental guarantees, and ultimately errs in legal subsumption. In plain Portuguese, they called something a crime that the law does not classify as a crime, and they sought to convict based on evidence that simply does not exist. Fux's vote begins by reminding us of the function of the Federal Supreme Court. It may seem obvious, but it bears repeating. The Federal Supreme Court is not a political platform, not a government office, nor an ideological trench. The Federal Supreme Court is the guardian of the Constitution. This means interpreting the law with rigor, applying the principle of legality, and respecting institutional limits. Line by line, Fux reiterates that a judge cannot decide guided by passions nor by popular outcry, much less by personal desires for conviction. And here enters a detail many prefer to ignore. The Constitution is not a convenience clause, applied when it suits and bent when it bothers. It applies to everyone, even to those accused of crimes the news insists on calling coup d'état. Fux himself recalls that in criminal proceedings there is no room for invention. Either the facts fit perfectly within the law, like a glove on a hand, or they do not fit, and then there is no crime. Period. This is the essence of the vote. Technical rigor against interpretive elasticity, legal guarantee against persecution disguised as process. It is against this backdrop that he dismantles one by one the pillars of the accusation sustained by Alexandre de Moraes. Here begins the implosion of the farce. Alexandre de Moraes attempts to argue that the Supreme Court would be competent to judge all defendants, even those without functional privileged jurisdiction, and that to expedite, it would suffice to transfer the case to a chamber, reducing the panel. Seems like a procedural detail? Precisely in this detail lies the most scandalous violation of the principle of the natural judge. Fux's vote is crystal clear. The original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is extremely exceptional. It is in Article 102 of the Constitution, black on white, and the consolidated rule until then was simple. If the defendant loses office, they simultaneously lose jurisdiction. The case descends. Simple, logical, constitutional. But suddenly, they invented a very recent thesis, conveniently molded to keep the case at the Supreme Court, even years after the facts. This is not hermeneutics, it is legal jury rigging, and it does not stop there. Fux goes further and exposes the next absurdity. Even if one accepted the idea of judging defendants as if they were president, the competence would lie with the full bench of the Supreme Court, never with a chamber. Reducing the trial to only part of the court means silencing justices, amputating voices, concentrating power, an institutional scandal. In other words, when dealing with a case of this magnitude, hiding it within a chamber is like holding a secret trial inside the Supreme Court itself. Fux's conclusion? Absolute nullity of all decisive acts performed. And here is the point. This is not a matter of opinion or narrative. It is clear and certain law. It is the Constitution speaking louder. If the trial begins in an incompetent forum, the entire process is tainted from the outset. If there is one thing that separates a serious trial from an exceptional tribunal, it is respect for full defense. And here, again, the accusation slipped into the most grotesque illegality. Alexandre de Moraes claimed the defense had access to all probative material. It sounds good on paper, but in practice, what occurred was a true assault on the right to contradiction. Fux exposes the fraud. Nothing less than 70 terabytes of data were dumped onto the defense, and not with organization, not with adequate time, not with clarity. It was the famous document dumping, or, in free translation, throwing a tsunami of disordered information onto the lawyer to feign transparency but render any real analysis impossible. Folders without names, files without indexes, absence of minimal cataloging. Even the justice himself admitted the difficulty navigating this chaos. Imagine then the defendant who depends on this to defend himself. This is not providing access to evidence. This is a dirty game. A charade to fulfill formality while violating the essence of the guarantee. The Supreme Court has already consolidated understanding on this in binding summary number 14, which ensures the lawyer full and organized access to elements of proof. Doctrine is clear. The defense cannot be surprised by mountains of illegible data, especially at the last minute. Courts across Brazil have already acquitted defendants in analogous cases precisely because this practice kills contradiction at its root. Fux was direct. This procedure leads to the nullity of the process from the moment the indictment was accepted. It is not a minor procedural flaw, it is an incurable vice. And here the contrast is glaring. While Moraes pretends everything proceeded within legality, Fux reminds us that a criminal trial cannot be an obstacle course designed to sabotage the defense. In short, when the state resorts to procedural tricks to bury the right of defense under 70 terabytes of rubble, we are not facing justice. We are facing a digitized legal lynching. Now we enter the heart of the farce. The accusation tried to fit political conduct, meetings, and speeches into criminal types that simply do not apply. And it is at this point that Fux shows why criminal law is studied in the very first year of law school, because without typicity there is no crime. Criminal organization. The accusation's narrative is that the defendants integrated a criminal organization aimed at a coup d'etat. It sounds strong in the newspaper, but collapses at the first legal test. The criminal type of criminal organization requires stability, permanence, and the practice of undetermined crimes. It is not a group formed to commit a specific fact. If people join together to commit specific and time-delimited offenses, that is called joint criminal action, not criminal organization. Moreover, the law requires that the targeted crimes carry a maximum penalty exceeding 4 years. The indictment failed to narrate this in even minimally consistent fashion. Worse, it tried to increase the penalty by alleging use of firearms without proving actual use, confusing legitimate possession with concrete use. Fux disarms the trick and concludes there is no way to subsume the facts to the criminal type. Result? Dismissal of the accusation for all defendants, including Mauro Cid and Almir Garnier. Violent abolition of the democratic rule of law and coup d'etat. Here the accusation attempted a backflip without a safety net. Fux applies the principle of consumption. If there is a means crime and an end crime, only the more serious one is punished. That is, coup d'etat and violent abolition cannot be accumulated. And he goes further. Article 359L requires that the conduct aim at the material suppression of all elements of the democratic rule of law. It is not enough to have a harsh speech, not enough to hold a meeting of supporters, not enough to plot abstractly. There must be an immediate executory act capable of placing at real risk the separation of powers, alternation in power, and fundamental freedoms. Fux differentiates with precision. Mere contemplation is not a crime. Preparatory act is not a crime. There is only crime when there is an executory act immediately preceding consummation. Coup plots, followed by searches for accomplices, remain in the realm of the unpunishable. And here comes the most explosive point. Regarding Jair Bolsonaro, Fux recalls that the criminal type of coup d'etat presupposes deposing a legitimately constituted government. But he was the very office holder. Inventing a self-coup, by analogy, is tearing penal legality to shreds and creating a monstrous precedent. Moreover, the Penal Code itself, in Article 359T, shields critical expression against constitutional powers, excluding it from the penal sphere. The presidential veto against attempts to criminalize electoral fake news also confirms political speech is not punished. Fux drives the point home. interviews, harsh statements, petitions to the judiciary contesting elections. All this lies beyond the reach of criminal law. Qualified damage and damage to listed property. Finally, the argument that the defendants contributed to the destruction of public property on January 8, 2023, collapses before the principle of subsidiarity. If the damage would be a means to more serious crimes, it is absorbed. One cannot punish twice. Moreover, one cannot apply objective or joint liability in criminal matters. Specific intent and individualized conduct are required. Fux points to the absence of any proof that Mauro Cid or Almir Garnier ordered, determined, or even encouraged the vandalism. The accusation here is pure guesswork without probative foundation. What do we have so far? A festival of mischaracterizations, a trampling of the principle of legality, an attempt to stretch criminal types beyond where the law permits. Fuchs's vote reminds us that criminal law is not elastic rubber to be molded to the judge's convenience. It is a limit, it is a guarantee. And in this same sense, when we observe the narratives imposed upon our daily lives, we perceive how they no longer present themselves as simple, factual reports, but as meticulously crafted constructions designed to generate psychological effect. It is no longer about informing, but about framing, suggesting to the public not only what to think, but especially what to feel. The engineering of perception replaces the search for truth, and the sensation that we live in a controlled scenario becomes increasingly evident. This control is not something recent. It manifests in different historical moments with different guises, but always aimed at shaping consciences and domesticating the collective imagination. When ancient empires constructed their founding myths, or when the medieval church established the official narrative of faith and salvation, it was already the same mechanism, centralizing discourse, homogenizing worldview, and ensuring the population remained within the bounds of the acceptable. What changes today is technical sophistication. The empire of information no longer needs brute force to silence dissent. It suffices to overdose on content, trivialize the absurd, and constantly invert meaning so that reality becomes malleable. It is at this point that the term Venezuelanization assumes a paradigmatic character. We are not speaking merely of a specific political condition of a neighboring country, but of a model of institutional degradation that can be replicated in any society. The formula is known: capture of institutions, packing of the justice system, intimidation of opponents, economic manipulation, and above all, maintenance of a discourse that inverts roles. Persecutors present themselves as victims, corrupt as saviors, censors as defenders of freedom. In Brazil, the unsettling realization is that many of these elements are already present. Judicial activism, selectivity in law enforcement, strategic silence in the face of systemic scandals, and criminalization of dissent reveal a state drifting from its republican function and dangerously approaching the logic of authoritarian regimes. The difference, and perhaps the greater gravity, is that this process occurs under a democratic facade, as if it were possible to maintain appearances while destroying the essence. But more than denouncing symptoms, it is necessary to understand the philosophical root of this crisis. Whenever a society abandons its foundational values in exchange for promises of immediate stability, space opens for tyranny. And tyranny, whether declared or disguised, is maintained not by force alone, but by persuasion. The greatest enemy of freedom is not the external oppressor, but internal apathy, the willingness to accept comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. If we look at history, we see that empires collapsed not merely due to barbarian invasions or economic pressure, but due to the internal collapse of their own principles. Rome did not fall overnight. Before being invaded, it was already corroded from within, unable to sustain the civic virtue that had been its foundation. Similarly, Western modernity, built upon ideals of freedom, rationality, and human dignity, finds itself today threatened by slow and constant erosion, fed by political cynicism and social indifference. Here lies the dilemma of our time. Either we rediscover the capacity to act as conscious subjects, reclaiming the public sphere, or we become passive spectators of civilizational collapse. If history teaches us anything, it is that authoritarian regimes depend above all on the passivity of the people. The state may create laws, courts, and repressive apparatuses, but the real force that sustains or topples these structures comes from the conscious action of the collective. Citizenship is not a paper title, nor an electoral registration. It is constant practice, active vigilance, and moral courage. In societies where the population grows accustomed to observing injustice without reacting, power becomes absolute by default. He who remains silent before arbitrariness, even if not directly committing crime, contributes to the perpetuation of abuse. And it is here that the difference manifests between a formally democratic state and a state of democratic appearance. In the former, citizens exercise and oversee their rights. In the latter, they merely watch the spectacle of manipulation. Fux, in his vote, indirectly reminds us of this logic by emphasizing the necessity of guaranteeing contradiction, full defense, and respect for legality. Each procedural vice, each excess committed by the judge, is not merely an institutional flaw, but a warning to society. Without active vigilance, any judicial apparatus can be transformed into an instrument of political persecution. Civil resistance, therefore, is not mere symbolic gesture. It is concrete practice, questioning narratives, demanding transparency, organizing collectively, and protecting fundamental rights. It is creating mechanisms of control over those who govern, judicialize, or interpret the law. And here lies the great irony. The more one seeks to criminalize citizens or political opponents, the more evident it becomes that true power does not lie in the court or the legislator's pen, but in the critical consciousness of society. In this context, historical examples abound. Revolutions, independence movements, civil rights struggles, and resistances against tyrannies have always arisen from collective action and the engagement of individuals willing to defend greater principles. What changes is merely the form of oppression. If before it was armies and explicit censorship, today it is media manipulation, judicialization of politics, and selective application of laws. The essence, however, remains. Without vigilant citizens, freedom fades. Therefore, the citizen's role is neither passive nor neutral. It is the last bulwark against institutionalized arbitrariness. Defending rights, questioning arbitrary decisions, and demanding impartial application of the law is not radicalism. It is fulfillment of the social contract that founds the Republic itself. We arrive at the crucial point. What Fux makes clear in his vote is that Alexandre de Moraes' narrative, that story of the orchestrated coup, does not withstand serious legal scrutiny. This is not a matter of political debate nor ideological preference. It concerns jurisprudence, the Constitution, and the Penal Code. Each piece of this accusation collapses before strict legality. Absolute incompetence, obstruction of defense, absence of typicity, lack of evidence, and non-existent intent. In practical terms, this means that attempting to criminalize speeches, preparatory acts, or political contemplations is juggling with the law, trampling fundamental guarantees, and creating grave precedents for citizenship. Fux reminds us, indirectly but forcefully, that the law does not bend to the judge's convenience or media pressure. It protects defendants, yes, but it protects the entire society by preventing institutionalized arbitrariness from disguising itself as criminal process. And it is precisely here that the civilizational dimension connects. The weakness of the accusation and the attempt to impose convictions without evidence reveal a larger phenomenon: the risk of erosion of democratic institutions when society remains passive. Criminal law is not merely a tool of punishment, it is an instrument of balance, and this balance is maintained only if conscious citizens watch, question, and resist the instrumentalization of laws. Therefore, the message is clear. It is not merely about defending specific defendants, but about defending the rule of law, freedom of expression, and the principle of the natural judge. Each procedural vice, each abuse of competence, each attempt to criminalize political speech is a lesson for all of us. Democracy demands attention, engagement, and civil courage. Ultimately, Fux's vote serves as a beacon. It not only legally dismantles the accusation of coup, but reminds us that active citizenship is the last shield against arbitrariness. And let us be honest, in a country where processes can be manipulated, where data is dumped in tsunamis to obstruct defense, and where criminal types are stretched like rubber bands, the people's vigilance is the only guarantee that the law will remain on the side of justice and not spectacle. Thank you for staying with me until here. Until the next Decoder Talks.